so I can hear you all. Mostly, I can't hear anything now. It's sort of a strange sound room. So hi, everyone. I don't know if you all know who I am, but my name's Joe Brewer, and I have been the talking head of the Bioregional Activation Tour. Kind of literally, I've been giving talks for the last month in lots of places around Cascadia. And what I wanted to share with you all this morning, maybe I'll even change the view here. There we go. I don't know if that worked. Is I wanted to share with you some of the experiences that we had as a team as we traveled throughout Cascadia in the last 30 days, and to convey to you what we see as emerging potentials and shared challenges that were told to us directly by the people in the communities that we visited. So just briefly, for those of you who may not know what the tour was, we did this trip starting on October 2nd with Kayala, who's here on the call with us, was one of our first hosts, where we were in the Columbia River Gorge for a couple of days. Then we were in Eugene, Oregon, and Lost Valley, just south of Eugene. And then we were in Portland, Oregon. And then from there, we went up to Olympia. And then after Olympia, we went to Vashon Island. After Vashon Island, we went to Seattle. After Seattle, we went to Whidbey Island. After Whidbey Island, we went to Port Townsend and Fen River. Then after that, we went to Victoria on Vancouver Island. Then we went to Gabriola Island. Then we went and visited some old growth forest and people who were at the encampment for Fairy Creek. We were actually at Avatar Grove, but we were in that area and where we had some communion with trees. Then we went to Bellingham and the Nooksack watershed. And then we went to Skagit Valley and we were in Mount Vernon. And then we came back to Seattle. So in the span of 30 days, we traveled all over this spine of the Cascadia bioregion. Now, there are plenty of places we didn't go. We didn't go up into the Columbia Plateau. We just touched the edge of it. We didn't go up into the drainages of the Columbia River or of the Fraser River, going up toward the Rocky Mountains. Like, there are entire swaths of Cascadia we didn't visit. But what we did do is sort of create this this connection of coherence and storytelling across a significant spread of the Salish Sea and a significant part of the Willamette Valley as a major drainage into the Columbia Basin, and with the Columbia River Gorge being a key connector. So the sort of western side of Cascadia. And what we experienced was, maybe I'd say, a validation of a couple of things. One thing we validated is that Cascadia is indeed the most advanced, mature, sophisticated, developed, cultivated, whatever words you want to use. The bioregional movement of Cascadia is stronger than anywhere else on Earth. And it's a place that has deep threads going back decades. One of the things that happened for us every single place we went, without exception, was we met elders of the Cascadia movement who are helping to create the framework of Cascadia as a meme or as a cultural construct, as well as an independent, as an independence movement going back to the 1970s and 80s. So every single place we went, we met elders of this movement. And that's sort of like incredible in a way, to be able to have a conversation about the coherence of a cultural identity and the coherence of a story, and then to talk to people who were shaping how that story took form 40, 50 years ago. And they're all still with us. Not like all of the people at that time are with us, but everywhere we went, there were people in that place. So if you're in Bellingham, you got people like Doug to talk to. You know, if you're in Seattle, you got people like Lance to talk to. If you're in Eugene, you got David to talk to. Like, basically, there are founders of this movement in all of your communities, which is just incredible to be able to recognize that that is still true. And that while we were doing interviews with them, I actually didn't get to see any of the interviews. I was busy giving talks and having strategy meetings and doing other things. It was Brandon and Steven that would sneak off with the camera and go interview people. Was that a big part of what happened on this tour is we were able to begin archiving the oral history of Cascadia told from those elders at this moment in time, which is that we can begin to tell the story of the transition of the Cascadia movement for what came before and what comes next. And one of the sentiments that the elders of this movement had for us was that many of them felt like this was something that started a long time ago that in some ways dissipated for them, meaning that they felt the absence of connection of young people coming into it and carrying it forward. And there was this really strong sense of validation of their lives and of deep inspiration and deep meaning and connection for them to be face to face with young people who are entering into the Cascadia movement now through the lens of regeneration. So we had young people that were like regenerative farmers doing regenerative real estate, doing all kinds of things, regenerative finance, cryptocurrency tools for trying to save old growth forests, all kinds of interesting things that young people are doing. And to have them in the same room with these elders of the movement and for them to see each other was just like magic. It was really, really special. And so that's one of the things I want to name is that we validated Cascadia as a cultural entity. You could think of it as like there is a living cultural being that is Cascadia. And this living being is in the bodies of people that goes back many decades, at least 40 years, for some people 50 years. And that there are young people who are stepping into the expression of it and shaping it to the times that we're in. The other thing that we saw that was really validated for us was that while each place has its own unique personality and its own unique flavor of leadership for the people that are there, every place had the same challenges, which probably isn't surprising because the challenges that we face are challenges that are fully systemic, that are planet-wide, and so we should expect them to be expressed in multiple places. We found land speculation and what I would call is the symptoms of the dying process of late-stage capitalism were present everywhere. So just as an example, there are many examples, but as one example, the fact that farmland is too expensive for young people to get access to, and there are older people who would like to pass on farming traditions to young people, but if they had children themselves, their children went off to the city a long time ago. You know, this sort of brokenness of intergenerational relationships and the fragmentation of land and the economics being completely dysfunctional. This was everywhere. It was just everywhere. But at the same time, there were beacons of light. So as an example of one beacon of light when we were in Eugene was we got to visit the suburban permaculture demonstration of Jan Spencer. She's like 23 years old. It's a suburban home converted into a permaculture integration. It's like there's a garden, but there's also water catchment, but there's also a tool space. There's this patterning of the neighbors on the land into the neighbors' land across the neighborhood. Mike, who's on the call with us, took us to visit a family that had bought some land about 2 years ago and we're starting an urban farmstead, and they're a 5-minute walk from Jan's land. That's not accidental. That this legacy of someone doing culture hacking of suburban homes with permaculture thinking and then blending it into urban farming is something that's happening across a part of Eugene, Oregon. And so we would see these really powerful blends everywhere we went. I'll give another example with Brian Kirklevitt, who's here on the call with us, who's the founder of Inspiration Farm in Bellingham. Anyone who has been to Bellingham would really quickly stumble upon this permaculture farm, but you'd have to get a tour and travel around a little bit to see that people would watch Brian moving water into the land, and then they would ask him to come do it on their land. And as we were riding around through the landscape, Brian is like, oh yeah, I helped that person set up a water retention system. Oh, I helped that person do contour swales. Oh, this person's starting to do reforestation. And you can see that the idea of private land ownership is secondary And the cultural exchanges across the land was primary through these human relationships and through the models of stewardship and land management. And this is something we saw all over the place. When we were on Whidbey Island, and we were talking with Neil and Alyssa Collins, and with Ross Chapin and Deborah Chapin-Ross, where they were talking about community land trusts and farmland connected with conservation within a watershed in the middle of South Whidbey Island. Again, the idea of private land ownership was blended and softened, and the idea of cultural exchanges and collaborative land management were ascending. I would say ascending because they were more strongly expressed in some places, less strongly expressed in others. But the idea of private land ownership was unuseful and was a barrier to what neighbors wanted to do with each other. And so the idea of private land ownership was secondary, and collaborative cultural patterns were primary. This is something we saw in many places. Another thing that we saw was that there are some really clear geographic patterns that we should try to articulate further. And I want to name a couple of these. One of them is what happens on islands. So the islands that we visited were Vashon Island, Whidbey Island, Gabriola Island. I would consider Vancouver Island its own entity because in many ways it's technically an island, but it's so large that it's not like an island in some ways. But definitely to say that the Salish Sea with the Gulf Islands and the San Juan Islands, and then Vashon as this, where does it even fit in the weirdness of our jurisdictions, is that when we were on these islands, every one of them had a very clear sense of their boundedness, which is really important. So when we were on Gabriola Island, it was helpful that Bill Reese, the co-founder of Ecological Footprint, who's from Vancouver, he and his ex-wife, when they were married, lived on Gabriola part-time. So he helped to bring the thinking of carrying capacity to Gabriola Island. So on Gabriola Island, when we talked about, actually, we didn't even talk about Gabriola Island, we didn't talk about carrying capacity. Someone on Gabriola Island brought it up, and then they all started talking with each other because they'd already had multiple years of conversations about carrying capacity. Whereas in most places, as an ecologist or an ecologically minded person, you would have to introduce carrying capacity. You'd have to define it. People wouldn't really understand what it means. On Gabriola Island, they have already been thinking about it for years because of the connection to the ecological footprint and Bill Reese, but also because it's an island. And one thing they said on Gabriola is every day there's at least one tanker truck of water that comes across the ferry to people's homes. So carrying capacity is a daily management challenge for water availability for potable water on Gabriola Island. So when we looked at Gabriola, Whidbey, and Vashon, like the conversations people were having there, it was very clear that a collaboration between them should be established and should be facilitated and hosted about regenerative land management practices, around food security and food sheds, around water management, around economic development patterns that can create livelihoods for young people, and ecosystem restoration practices as they relate to that economic development process. From there, you have affordable housing, you have land trusts, you have other things that start to come into play that get into the details. But what we found is in all three of those islands, there was multiple years, I would say decades of work in each place that was slightly different expressions, but shared thematic exploration, which means that we could create direct learning exchanges between them that could be very powerful for each of them and for all of them together. Another thing that we saw that was very similar kind of broad coherence was what it means to think about regenerative education with place-based learning sites. So I want to name some place-based learning sites that might seem different at first. Like one of the first places we went to was Ahtlan Center, which is on the White Salmon River in the Columbia River Gorge. Kayala, who's on the call, is one of the founders of Ahtlan Center. It's aspiring to become an eco-village. They have a healing center, learning center, kind of a dynamic that's forming. And they're not very far from Portland, Oregon. So they already have some social connectivity to young people in Portland. So there's a learning site on their land. Then you have Lost Valley down in Eugene, right, which is another learning site. Then you have the Whidbey Institute on Whidbey Island, a retreat center, a learning site. Then you have Fort Worden State Park on the Olympic Peninsula, which is this existing campus with lots of infrastructure, and there are people in Port Townsend trying to envision it as a regenerative campus for the Salish Sea. And then you have Claremont High School, which is in Victoria, where there's the Institute for Global Solutions, where I spoke with 11th and 12th graders in high school who are really passionate about these kinds of things. Now, I could keep going because we visited other learning sites, but just look at these that I'm naming. You see a diversity, but also a coherence. The coherence is that we can create programmatic structures for young people and for teachers, for the elders who have knowledge, or olders, because they may be younger than elder, that could actually create robust learning dynamics between them. And I didn't even name all the ones we visited. We visited quite a few. But what's interesting is if we were to focus on one of them, that one would have all of the struggles of any learning site. How do we attract enough students? How do we create a business model that works? How do we pay off debt on our land if we have it? Or how do we fund infrastructure into the future and avoid debt? You know, all of you who have learning centers, you know what I'm talking about. This is really hard stuff. So what's interesting is if we can create a consortium of learning centers who collaborate around bioregional learning strategies. Notice I'm using the words intentionally. It's learning about our bioregion, but it's strategies. What would be a strategy for getting more land into the commons? What would be a strategy for getting more young people access to affordable housing while they're learning? What would be a strategy for creating robust dynamics of landscape restoration with a continual flow of people learning and training? You know, and on and on. There are lots of elements of this strategy. The people to develop that strategy should be some kind of a council, a consortium, an alliance of some kind. And Regenerate Cascadia can help to cultivate that. And so I just want to name that because what we saw was regenerative education touches everything that needs to happen, and it touches everything that's already happening. It also, there are very clear places that are broken places in the system. Like there's broken places around access to land. There's broken places about access to labor or access to students. There are broken places around access to money. There are broken places around relational patterns that are healthy, say between older people and younger people, those who have money, those who don't, those who have land, those who don't, et cetera, et cetera. There are many places where there's a brokenness, and we can solve it at the bioregional scale much more easily than we can solve it at any individual place. And this leads to another thing I want to share is while we were in Victoria, we learned about the bioregional framework of the Saanich Peninsula. So those of you who don't know, you know, Vancouver Island's this big thing shaped like this, right? Down here on the southeast end of it is a peninsula that points out towards San Juan Island. That's the Saanich Peninsula. It's on the edge of Victoria, this urban area on the south end of the island. And on the Saanich Peninsula, starting in 2018, there were 3 municipalities where prior to 2018, among the 3 municipalities, there was always at least one mayor who was not interested in collaborating. So they could never create a collaborative framework. But in 2018, there was an election where all 3 mayors' positions of the municipalities were people who were aligned. And so there's a guy named Bob Pearce, who anyone on Vancouver Island probably knows, sort of like a local legend and another one of the elders of the movement. He stepped in and offered to create a bioregional framework for the Saanich Peninsula. And all 3 mayors bought in. And what they did is they created a knowledge sharing framework where they're like, wait, my transportation planning connects with yours and they overlap in a watershed. So I don't have data about how my transportation decisions affect your watershed. Your transportation system affects my watershed because we're in the same damn watershed. Like the absurdity and the insanity of our jurisdictions. So what they did was they started looking at the Saanich Peninsula, which is a coherent physical geography, and they started a data sharing, and they started a policy framework, like a discussion around policy frameworks. And what it led to was a monthly meeting among the staff of the 3 municipalities, the adoption of a bioregional framework for the 3 municipalities. And then the way it works in Canada is municipalities have a thing called an official community plan, which is a legally binding contract between the city government and the residents that says what their budget must be applied to and what their objectives are. And so what they did was when the official community plans were up for revision, they incorporated the bioregional framework into them, which requires as a mandate the sharing of data. It requires as a mandate that they meet collaborative goals as 3 separate municipalities. It creates a legal framework for entrenchment of collaboration. While I was in Victoria, I was brought to meet with 3 other mayors in the West Shore area. They actually represented 5 mayors. There were 2 of them that couldn't attend. Bob Pearce, the person who hosted the Saanich Peninsula framework, was in the room, and all 3 of the mayors agreed they want to adopt this framework, which means we're moving from 3 municipalities to the dog was excited. From 3 municipalities to 8, because we had 3 other mayors plus the 2 that they're in a consortium with. So we're up to potentially 8 municipalities. And just for those of you who don't know, Victoria has this thing called the Capital Regional District, which has 12 municipalities. Now we're talking about 8 of the 12 municipalities exploring how to create a bioregional framework. And then a day later, when we were on Gabriola, we talked about the same thing, and they said, we should build this into our community plan for Gabriola. And we know Bob Pearce too, because it's a small world. And we're starting to see these bioregional frameworks spreading and moving into local government, or at least a context where it can happen. And so what I wanted to say about this is the kind of thing that Regenerate Cascadia is catalyzing further. In this case, the Saanich Peninsula had already been doing this for about 5 years, but Regenerate Cascadia moving through created the context for the propagation of the idea. And it gives us a demonstration for the rest of Cascadia. How would you do this in Eugene, Springfield? How would you do this in the Portland area? How would you do this in Olympia, right? How would you learn from what's happening on Vancouver Island to say, look, here's a municipal government framework that has an explicitly bioregional approach to local data sharing. Why do we need local data sharing? And now you could start to think about this for the San Juan Islands, which is something we talked about when we were in the Skagit Valley. Should the San Juan Islands build a bioregional framework for data sharing among their governing entities? Because they're already having that conversation. How do they do it? Well, talk to Bob Pearce. From the Saanich Peninsula, you can throw a rock to San Juan Island, or almost. It's pretty close. And so what we can see is the profound coherence of geography showing us how to create these frameworks of collaboration. So this is the kind of thing that we started to see that would never be made visible if we didn't have the conversation the way we did, where we would very briefly move from place to place, having the same conversation and revealing potential connections, so that then we could start to create coordination among them. Now, there's another thing that we saw, which is really high impact opportunities. Now, we only found a couple, right? Like, this was super fast. In 30 days, 14 communities, how much could we really see? But I want to name a couple of really big opportunities that we saw that can actually connect with each other. One of them is the parallel between things that are happening in different parts of the bioregion. Like when we went to visit Keala at Atlan Center, we were sort of surprised, like, what? There was a dam removal on the White Salmon River in 2012? Everyone knows about the Elwha dam removal, but almost no one knows about the white salmon. So we found there's a learning opportunity about what happens when you remove a dam that doesn't just use one site, but can use parallel sites and then help build the case for other dam removals. So this is between the white salmon and the Elwha is an obvious relationship around dam removal, economic impacts, cultural impacts, ecological impacts that moves from individual case study to demonstration of model. We saw that as really powerful. And the Atlan Center is literally like on the edge of the white salmon dam removal. From their learning center, you walk 5 minutes less. It's like right there. I mean, it's literally right there. You can throw a rock at it. It's that close. And we didn't know about that connection. Another parallel example we found was around watershed restoration. Because we went to Tryon State Park in Portland, Oregon, which is a really powerful, like 5-mile long watershed that is almost completely restored. There's 1,000 feet of concrete culverts where Tryon Creek goes through a culvert to get to the Willamette River. That 1,000 feet of concrete pipe is the only remaining part of the watershed to be restored. They already have budget and approval and are finalizing their plan to remove that culvert, which means we are almost to the completion of a full restoration of an entire watershed in Portland. And it's got a state park. There's a permaculture farm and a Waldorf Montessori school. There's longstanding relationships with elementary schools in Portland. The Friends of Tryon Creek, which is a nonprofit, have a new executive director that's Indigenous, and they are forming deep relationships with Indigenous groups. They're bringing cultural burning practices to Tryon State Park to have Indigenous people teach cultural burning practices for fire management, which has bioregional implications. So Tryon Creek is this incredible example of a watershed restoration that's almost complete. Now you go back to Victoria and you have Bowker Creek. Bowker Creek is about the same size, 8 kilometers or 5 miles, but it's about 90% covered in concrete in an urban center. And the Friends of Bowker Creek for the last 20 years have been trying to daylight little parts of it, or removing the concrete, doing riparian restoration in little parts of it. And it's really slow, really painstaking, honestly, depressing work. It's like soul crushing work, how hard it is and how slow it is. But they're so devoted, they're still at it. Bowker Creek did not know about Tryon Creek. Tryon Creek does not know about Bowker Creek. We can create learning exchanges between the two at very different stages of development. And now to move out to the design school level of the work that Penny and I are a part of at the planetary scale, is that Penny and I did a bioregional activation tour in the greater Takaranto bioregion and the Toronto area earlier this year, where we know about the Don River restoration in downtown Toronto. Toronto is a massive city. And after about 27 years of community activism, not that different from Bowker Creek, they got 1.2 billion Canadian dollars of provincial money from the Ontario government to do a riparian restoration of the entire Don River that goes through the core of downtown Toronto. The absolute impossible is happening and nearly complete. Imagine restoring an entire watershed in a completely urbanized area in the largest city in Canada. That's what's happening. So Bowker Creek has a parallel to the Don River, and it has a parallel to Tryon Creek. So for us to create these connections, it has transformational potential for education, for funding, for policy frameworks, for Indigenous relationships, because each place is different in all of these things. And so I just want to name this pattern of the parallel, which is that we would see parallel opportunities for the same model system, where the model system in this case is about a 5-mile long watershed that's embedded in an urban area. Tryon Creek, that's almost completely restored. It's right next to Lewis and Clark College. and Bowker Creek, which is almost completely unrestored in an urban area, which also has a parallel to Toronto that's not in the bioregion. Just to name how these patterns of the parallel can work. So you see what I'm trying to share here is those of us traveling through places where we would go to Eugene and then go to Portland and then go to the next place, we would see these patterns because of the way that we experienced everything in a very unique way. Now we need to show everyone in Cascadia how to see in the same way. And how can you travel in this way? How can you look for these opportunities and connections? And then what are the organizing supports that you need to actually manifest them, to go from potential to manifestation? Now, another thing that we started to see were what I might call, using my fingers, global assets, where global doesn't mean the globe. I mean, it's systemically applicable to Cascadia. You can actually apply it in other places too, but I just want to talk about the power of individual people. Like Brian at Inspiration Farm. Brian, we need you teaching watershed restoration all over Cascadia, which means we might need to bring people to Inspiration Farm so you can stay there. But I would call Brian an exemplar of a global asset. To have someone with 29 years of experience restoring watersheds and local food systems and replicating it across the Nooksack and Skagit rivers. Some of you know about that work in other parts of Cascadia, others don't. So we need to identify these global assets. I'm using quotes because I want to be careful that I'm not intentionally using the framing of that context, but I want to name the significance of it. The significance of it's a really big deal. Yeah, and Phoebe's mentioning Paul Saragino and Olympia. I haven't talked about Olympia yet because there's a really powerful opportunity in Olympia. But I just want to name that identifying these global assets that are humans and places. I'm going to name a place that's a global asset, the Whidbey Institute. The Whidbey Institute, which used to be the Chinook Learning Center, is a global asset in the sense that it is immensely valuable to the entire Cascadia bioregion. As a place, because South Whidbey Island is an acupuncture point of spiritual energy for the planet. Just ask the Skagit tribe or anyone who lives on Whidbey Island. Like, people go to Whidbey Island because the energy of that place. And the Whidbey Institute is anchored to a very powerful spiritual place in the landscape. But it's also a historical place in time because of its history. People like Gary Snyder and Peter Berg meeting at the Chinook Learning Center in the early 80s, for example. Because the Whidbey Institute has so many examples. The Whidbey Institute is a global asset to Cascadia. Now, there are many global assets. I'm just making examples. I'm not trying to say that others aren't important, but we have to learn how to find our global assets as a bioregion. And so these are two. There are people, there are places, there are processes, there are models. Like the Saanich Peninsula's bioregional framework is a model that could be a global asset, or it could be cultivated into one. Just to name how we should be, what kinds of eyes we need to have to see our landscape. Now I want to go back to Paul Saragino and Olympia. Those of you who don't know Paul is a revolutionary insider because he works for the government. He's within the government, but he's an absolute revolutionary. And he's really good at walking both sides. And one of the things that Paul said to me, well, he said to us as a group when we were in Olympia, was how frustrated he is that community activists tend to just be opposed to the government instead of organizing in a way to collaborate with the people who work in the public sector employees who are trying to cultivate the funding models for their work. So what's happening in Olympia, which is another global asset, is Olympia represents two things. It represents the symbolic seat of colonial conquest by placing a Capitol building, a symbol of colonial power, at the bottom of the Salish Sea. But it also represents the bottom of the Salish Sea, which is that the Deschutes River enters into the Salish Sea in Olympia, and someone had the brilliant idea of putting a dam there so that they could have a reflection pool so that people of power at the Capitol building could take their picture next to the reflection pool. So there's this reflecting pool for the Capitol building with this lake that's in Olympia. All of you have been to Olympia, know what I'm talking about. It's really beautiful in a sort of European colonial way. It's really unhealthy in an ecological way, because the story we heard from people in Olympia was when they took their children to that lake, or when they themselves were children, they would ask their parents, why are all the fish dead? Why is this lake so unhealthy? And there's a place where the dam is for that lake, which the indigenous people there talked about it as the gathering place of bears because there were so many salmon. And there was a massacre that took place there to wipe out some of the indigenous people as part of the claiming of the territory for the capital. So there's a history that is a violent colonial history and an ecological violence to the place when the dam was put in. So here is the great opportunity. After 20 years of activism in the community, they're going to remove the dam, and they're going to start an estuary restoration. And there's 180 million US dollars of government money already being allocated to it. That's being set aside. And because of the battle, the framing of battle between community activists and the government, the community groups that are best suited to manage and lead this restoration don't even know about the funding opportunities and are not organizing themselves. And Paul is very frustrated, because Paul knows people in the community, knows how big of an opportunity this is for the entire Salish Sea. He's no dummy. He's a very systemic thinker and doer. And he sits inside the governmental space wondering where his community friends are to receive this massive amount of funding that is probably going to be wasted through just inadequate allocation. Because the people in the government managing it want the same thing as the community activists. They're on the same side semantically. They're just not on the same institutionally because they don't know about each other. So there's a huge opportunity to basically sit down with Paul to learn how to do this. Paul will tell you, go apply for funding here. Let me review your application. I'll tell you the language to use because I helped write it from the other side so that you know how to get the funding. You know, the insider-outsider game. But there's also a bigger play. Where else in Cascadia can children go to learn how to restore an estuary in real life? Do you know of one? Because I don't. So there is a global educational opportunity, which is children all over Cascadia can go to Olympia. As part of this process in the next 10 years, we can structure educational exchanges to learn how to restore estuaries. Because it's going to happen. The estuary restoration is going to happen. And so this is a global opportunity for Cascadia, which means everyone in Cascadia can coordinate around how to restore the health of the Salish Sea and an estuary with indigenous collaboration, because there are some really good indigenous relationships in that area with the Yakima tribe and with others in that region, that this can actually be built up as a Cascadia-wide healing, transformation, education, restoration opportunity. And the way my screen's laid out, I'm seeing Mike nodding his head. I know Mike's in Eugene. People in Eugene probably don't think of Olympia in this way. It's too far away, but it's not. You know, it's all ecologically connected and culturally connected through Cascadia as a cultural process. So I just want to name these things. I see that we're at the point of having about 10 minutes left. And I hope you can see that my intention this morning is to set context from our direct experience to show you real opportunities for collaboration. And that's because I want to role model something here. While we are not going to have very much time for conversation with me right now, because in 10 minutes, Anna Perper is going to come on and start a session on pro-social. I hope this sets the context for the tone of the summit, because the tone of the summit is to practice how we collaborate enough that by the end of the summit, we have the lived experience that this wasn't a speaking tour, right? This wasn't Joe gives a talk, Joe gives a talk. Who's Joe? Joe doesn't even live in Cascadia. What the hell? This is how do we identify opportunities, mobilize resources, and create collaborative frameworks for real in Cascadia. That's the point of all of this. And so what we need to do is have a way of identifying these opportunities. We need to have templates and structures for collaboration around them. We need to create funding and governance models for all of these things. This is a huge amount of work. By the way, that work is not going to happen during the summit. We're just going to tiptoe into it. We're going to explore it and map it a little bit. The real work is what comes after the summit. So just like the summit is a place to direct the energy of the tour, the summit is going to be directing energy into what comes next, which is why Brandon has been so thoughtful about holding the awareness. He's very aware he's making up this summit, and that he's like, can you believe Brandon threw this together while we were on the tour? He started working on this a week ago to actually structure the program of it. And it's been self-organized with all of you. I just want to honor how important it is to stay in that creative emergence. But that's because Brandon knows that by the end of this summit, we need all of you to feel collective ownership of this so that you will work with him to create the structures you all need to continue moving forward. Now, for my role at the design school, at the kind of planetary level, I'm going to stay very engaged with Cascadia. Penny and I are already planning to come back to Cascadia in the next year and work more in person with several of you. So I'm not saying this to say, well, so long and thanks for all the fish. That's a Douglas Adams reference. That we're just actually, thanks for all the fish. The fish was awesome. Some really good salmon while I was here. Penny and I are leaving for Colorado on Monday. And then in 2 weeks, we go back to Columbia. But we are still engaged in Cascadia. We're not abandoning or leaving, but we are also not the leaders of this. The leaders of this are people in Cascadia. It's you who are the leaders of this. And I just want to make that really clear, because what we need to do is step into our leadership, each of us in our own ways. And luckily for you, you've got Brandon and Claire who are completely devoted to holding the Regenerate Cascadia process to move forward. You've also got Penny and me and the design school and the other things we're doing in other places to support them and all of you in this. But even more than that is you have all of you. We as the outsiders traveling through got to feel how much power and potential there is in this bioregion. And I just got to say, I am confident in this, that I will not find another bioregion on Earth as prepared as Cascadia to show how to do this at this scale, from what I've experienced here. And we need other places to see how to do it. So we're also going to be holding direct collaborations between Cascadia, the Colorado Basin, the Great Lakes, and the Northern Andes. Other places will come in as well, but for those four, at the design school, we're going to be holding relationships between all four, which means you can be confident that what you do here will have beneficial impact for those other places, and you'll get to learn from those other places. And we will hold the flow of resources that you might have a hard time funding things locally, but someone in Michigan is aligned that you never would have met otherwise. And we're going to help curate those relationships with you. But the key is that we have identified an immense opportunity for the future of humanity. And I maybe want to close, because I've just got a couple minutes left, with something that that happened in Mount Vernon at the end of our tour. Those of you who were in the opening session last night got to meet Jay Bowen. Some of you may have met him before. Jay Bowen is an incredible artist, and he's also an elder of the Skagit tribe. And he powerfully offered his medicine and wisdom to us on our last night of the tour. But I want to say something that he said, because he said, basically, we have 5 years. I don't remember the exact number of days. He's like, we have 1,800 days. He said some number, it was something like that. It's like, where right now we have a choice to do this, but in 5 years, no one will have a choice because of the accelerating collapse. That might even be an optimistic projection. It might even be worse. But there's another thing he said. He said, with completely straight face to the people in the room, you are the most important people on earth. Because in 5 years, when people turn on their tap and there's no water, or they go to the grocery store and there's no food, the most people on earth are the people who know how to grow food, who have been saving seeds, who have been, creating local food security, that have been doing local ecosystem restoration. The people doing this regenerative work are the most important people on earth. I completely agree with Jay on this. The most important humans on earth are the humans who are collaborating with Gaia, Pachamama, the Great Spirit, the Creator. Those of us who are collaborating with the life-giving energies of the earth are the most important humans on earth. We have to completely reframe power, prestige, and importance. Completely reframe it. It's a deep healing process. And as we do that, we're going to see that the actions we take as individuals in the next 2 or 3 years are going to be some of the most consequential actions we can take. Now, I'm not saying this to overwhelm you with responsibility. I'm saying it to empower you with purpose. Because the biggest threat is depression, suicide. It's checking out of the game, because it's not going to get any easier from here. It's going to keep getting harder. We have to lean in, and we cannot lean in with a really solid purpose. All of us here are good, discerning, critical thinkers. We can smell bullshit. So if someone offers us a bullshit utopia, it'll only depress us further. Right? It'll turn us off. We need a purpose we can actually believe in that passes our BS sniffers. This is a deep purpose that passes the bullshit sniffer. Cascadia has a role for the planet, and you have a role for each other. And as we proved in the last 30 days, there are huge opportunities for moving through your landscapes with a different story and finding the opportunities to connect, and then doing the work of weaving those connections. And I'm honestly excited. I'm like, I can't wait to see what you do, because I absolutely love Cascadia. I spent a third of my life here. It's a deep part of me. I got to feel the waters moving at Deception Pass as we went through the channel between the Gulf Islands and the San Juan Islands. I got to feel it in Sahaley Falls on the Mackenzie River. I got to feel it in the Strait of Juan de Fuca. I felt the waters moving. Now what I want to feel is the humans moving with the waters. And so I see it's time for me to pass the talking stick back to Brandon. Brandon, did you just want to come up over here and do it from here? Or?
I think it's all good. I think the main thing is that Anna will be presenting in this room, and Brian will be presenting in the Sasquatch room. And
okay.
So you can find that link on the website if you need to jump over.
Okay. And Anna is here. I don't know. Anna, are you here? I don't even know if Anna's here.
Yes, I am.
Awesome. So just so everyone knows that in this room, Anna is going to continue and bring us into a conversation about pro-social and how to create pro-social frameworks, which are actually fundamental to everything we're talking about here, as you will see as Anna talks about this. I don't know if I need to facilitate anything with Anna, if Anna's just going to take over. Anna,
yeah, I'll just take over.
I'll pass it over to Anna. And just so you all know, Brian Kirklevitt is going to be facilitating a session. Brian, are you still here? What time is your session start? Because it's going to be,
he's already over.
oh, he's already over in the Sasquatch room, which is the other Zoom link. So if you want to stay here with Anna to explore ProSocial, Anna's here to take over. And Anna, do you have hosting abilities?
Not yet.
Give
All right,
her.
I'll give
Make her
those to you.
co-host. Make her co-host.
Anna, where are you? Oh, there you are. I'll make you the co-host. There you are. And so Anna's going to take over in this room. And I want to encourage you all to reach out to me personally if you want to talk to me, although I'm going to have limited bandwidth in the next little while. But mostly just keep in this process with Brandon and Claire, with the team that's forming. Join their team, be the team, and let us know how we can help. So now I'm going to hand it over to Anna. Anyone who wants to go and learn about watershed restoration, go over to Sasquatch, the other Zoom link with Brian. And thank you guys for letting me join you this morning. Have a beautiful day.